Once upon a time, in a small village called Irurund, 3 boys lived in a dusty little hut. Their names were Ogana, Ikeen, and Chike. They were very poor and had no money to buy nice clothes, food, or even school books. Every day, they sat under the big mango tree, dreaming of becoming rich like the chief who owned the biggest house in the village. One day, Ogana spoke up. "I'm tired of being poor. I heard about a native doctor in the forest. They say he can make people rich." Chike's eyes grew wide. "Rich? How?" Ikeen, who was always the bravest, nodded. "Let's go and find out. What do we have to lose?" The boys agreed and set out that evening. The forest was dark, and the path was narrow, but they didn't stop. They finally reached a small mud house covered with dried leaves. An old man with gray hair and a long scar across his face stood outside. He was the native doctor. "I know why you're here," the man said before they could even speak. His voice was deep, like the rumble of thunder. "You want to be rich?" The boys looked at each other in shock. "Yes, Baba," Ogana said, bowing his head. The native doctor pointed to a wooden door. "Come inside." Inside the room, there were 3 shiny coffins lined up in the corner. The boys felt a cold chill run down their spines, but they didn't say a word. "If you want wealth," the native doctor began, "you must sleep in these coffins for 7 nights. But you must not open the coffin or try to leave. When you wake up on the 8th day, you will have more money than you can carry." The boys stared at the coffins in fear. Ikeen's hands trembled, but he still spoke first. "We'll do it," he said, trying to sound confident. Ogana and Chike nodded, though their hearts were beating fast. The native doctor gave them a warning. "Remember, no matter what happens, stay inside. And one last thing. Not everyone who sleeps in the coffin will wake up." "What do you mean?" Chike asked, his voice shaky. The native doctor didn't answer. He simply smiled, showing his yellow teeth. "Decide now." The boys huddled together. They were scared, but the thought of being rich was too sweet to let go. Finally, they all agreed. "We'll do it," Ogana said. That night, the boys climbed into the coffins. The lids were closed, and darkness surrounded them. It was cold and quiet, but they didn't dare make a sound. The first night passed. Nothing happened. The second night, they heard strange whispers, but they stayed still. On the third night, Chike thought he felt something crawling on his skin. He wanted to scream, but he remembered the warning. By the 5th night, the whispers grew louder. They sounded like voices, calling their names. Ikeen, Ogana, Chike. Ogana covered his ears inside the coffin. Chike squeezed his eyes shut. Ikeen, the bravest, whispered to himself, "I can do this. I want to be rich." On the 6th night, something strange happened. One of the coffins began to shake. It was Chike's. He couldn't take it anymore. His heart pounded as he gripped the sides of the coffin. "Ogana, Ikeen, are you awake?" Chike whispered, his voice trembling, but there was no reply. Something heavy seemed to press down on his chest. He struggled to breathe. He wanted to push the lid open, but he remembered the native doctor's warning. The 7th night arrived, and the air in the room became colder than ever. It felt as if the spirits were walking among them. One of the boys suddenly stopped moving. But which one? The room fell silent. The coffins were still. When the morning light streamed through the window, the native doctor returned. He opened the first coffin and smiled. He opened the second, and his smile grew wider. But when he opened the third, his smile disappeared. Who was inside the third coffin, and why wasn't there a smile this time? The native doctor stood silently, staring into the third coffin. His face twisted, as if he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. He turned back to the other 2 coffins and muttered under his breath, words so quiet they sounded like hissing snakes. Ogana and Ikeen slowly sat up in their coffins, their faces pale. They rubbed their eyes and looked around. "We did it," Ogana whispered, though his voice trembled. Ikeen looked toward the third coffin, his heart racing. "Where's Chike?" he asked. The native doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed a bony finger at the third coffin. "One of you is now closer to the spirits than to the living," he said cryptically. Ogana and Ikeen exchanged worried glances. They crawled out of their coffins and hesitantly approached the third one. Ogana's hands trembled as he reached for the lid, but the native doctor's sharp voice stopped him. "Do not touch it," he barked. His eyes glowed faintly, and the air grew heavy. "The journey is not yet over." "What do you mean?" Ikin demanded. His voice cracked, but there was anger mixed with fear. "Chaik was our friend. Is he dead?" The native doctor shook his head. "He is not dead. Not yet." His words sent chills down their spines. Ogana stepped forward, desperation etched on his face. "What happened to him? You told us we'd all be rich." "I told you the truth," the native doctor said. "You will have wealth beyond your dreams. But wealth has its price. One of you has been chosen to pay that price." "Chosen?" Ikin shouted. "We didn't agree to this." "Didn't you?" the native doctor said, his voice calm but cold. "You came to me. You lay in the coffins. You made your choice." Ogana and Ikin were silent. They looked at the third coffin again, their hearts sinking. "What happens to Chaik now?" Ogana asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The native doctor's eyes narrowed. "That depends." "Depends on what?" Ikin pressed. The old man took a deep breath and leaned closer to them. "On whether you are willing to finish the ritual. The spirits are waiting. The final step must be taken tonight." Ogana's throat went dry. What do we have to do?" The native doctor smiled again, but this time it was different. It was a smile full of secrets. He walked to the corner of the room and picked up a small, black pot. Inside, something glowed faintly, like burning embers. "Take this," he said, holding the pot out to them. "You must go into the forest, to the place where the three rivers meet. There, you will call on the spirits and offer them this gift." "What's in the pot?" Ikin asked, his voice shaking. The native doctor's smile grew wider. "The spirits do not like questions," he said. "Do as I say, and your friend may yet return. Do as I say, and your riches will come." Ogana hesitated. "And if we don't?" The native doctor's face darkened. "If you don't, you will lose more than your friend." The boys stared at the pot, their hearts heavy with fear and doubt. The room seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. They could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Ikin finally took the pot, his hands trembling. "We'll do it," he said, his voice firm but his eyes full of fear. Ogana nodded reluctantly. "For Chaik," he whispered. The native doctor stepped aside and opened the door. "Go now," he said, "and remember, the spirits are watching." As the boys stepped out into the cold night, the forest seemed darker than ever. Shadows moved among the trees, and strange sounds filled the air. They clutched the pot tightly and began their journey to the place where the three rivers met. But deep in their hearts, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The forest felt alive as Ogana and Ikin moved deeper into its shadows. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig, made them jump. The pot in Ikin's hands felt heavier with every step, as though it carried more than just its mysterious contents. "Do you hear that?" Ogana whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. Ikin froze. At first, there was silence. Then came the faint sound of footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves on the forest floor. "Who's there?" Ikin shouted, his voice trembling. The echo of his words disappeared into the night, but no one answered. Ogana grabbed Ikin's arm. "Don't stop. Keep moving," he urged, his voice barely audible. They quickened their pace, their breaths coming in short gasps. The sound of the footsteps followed them, sometimes near, sometimes far, but never gone. Finally, they reached the place where the three rivers met. The water shimmered under the moonlight, dark and quiet, as if it was holding its breath. The boys stood on the riverbank, unsure of what to do next. "What now?" Ogana asked, his voice shaking. Ikin opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the pot in his hands began to glow. A faint red light seeped from its edges, casting eerie shadows on their faces. Then, as if guided by an invisible hand, the lid of the pot slid open. Both boys stepped back, their eyes wide. Inside the pot was a strange, bubbling liquid that seemed to move like it was alive. From within the glow, They could hear faint whispers, soft, cold voices that spoke in a language they couldn't understand. Ogana swallowed hard. Is this the offering? Ikeen nodded slowly. I think so. But how do we give it to the spirits? Before either of them could figure out what to do, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The trees around them swayed violently, though there was no wind. The whispers from the pot grew louder, mingling with the sound of rushing water as the rivers seemed to rise. From the middle of the three rivers, a figure began to emerge. At first, it looked like smoke, swirling and twisting. Then it took shape, tall and shadowy, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. Ogana's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. What is that? Ikeen clutched the pot tightly, though his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold it. The shadowy figure pointed a long, bony finger at them, and its voice echoed like thunder. Why have you come? It asked, though its mouth did not move. Ogana and Ikeen exchanged terrified glances. Ikeen finally found his voice. We bring an offering. For our friend. And for wealth. The figure laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. You seek wealth, yet you tremble before its price. Ogana scrambled to his feet. We did what the native doctor told us. Please, let Chike go. We just want him back. The shadow tilted its head, as though considering their plea. Then it spoke again. The offering is not enough. What do you mean? Ikeen asked, his voice cracking. The native doctor said. The native doctor does not decide. The shadow interrupted. We do. The boy's heart sank. The glowing pot in Ikeen's hands began to shake violently, and the liquid inside spilled over, hissing as it touched the ground. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Another price must be paid, the shadow said, its red eyes glowing brighter. Ogana's voice was barely a whisper. What kind of price? The shadow reached out, its hand hovering over the boys. One of you must choose. Either you leave your friend behind forever, or one of you must stay with us. The weight of the words crashed over them like a tidal wave. Ikeen shook his head, backing away. No, we can't do this. Ogana clenched his fists, tears streaming down his face. Chike is our brother. We can't leave him. The shadow began to retreat toward the rivers, its voice fading but still clear. Decide before the moon sets, or the spirits will choose for you. As the figure disappeared into the water, the forest grew silent again. The boys stood there, paralyzed by fear and the impossible decision they had to make. Time was running out, and they could feel the eyes of the spirits watching them from the darkness. Ogana and Ikeen stood frozen at the edge of the rivers, their minds spinning. The night felt colder, darker, and heavier. The words of the shadowy figure echoed in their hearts. Decide before the moon sets, or the spirits will choose for you. The glowing pot in Ikeen's trembling hands dimmed, as though the spirits were losing patience. The boys huddled together, desperate for a solution. What do we do? Ogana whispered, his voice cracking. Ikeen's face was pale, his thoughts a storm of fear and guilt. Chike wouldn't leave us, he said softly. If it were us in that coffin, he'd stay to fight for us. We can't abandon him. Ogana nodded, though tears streamed down his face. But the spirits, one of us has to stay with them. How can we decide? A long silence passed between them. They didn't want to lose Chike, but neither could bear the thought of leaving the other behind. The weight of their friendship, their dreams, and their choices pressed down on them like the thick, silent night. Finally, Ikeen took a deep breath. I'll stay, he said, his voice steady. No, Ogana protested, grabbing his arm. We'll figure something out. There has to be another way. There isn't, Ikeen said, shaking his head. The spirits won't wait, and I can't let you or Chike suffer. You two can live the life we dreamed of, together. But one of us has to pay the price. Before Ogana could respond, Ikeen stepped forward and placed the pot at the edge of the river. He knelt down and looked up at the moon, his face calm but his eyes full of tears. Spirits, Ikeen called out, take me. Let Chike and Ogana go. Let them have the wealth we came here for. That's my price. The moment he spoke, the ground shook violently. The rivers churned, and a blinding light burst from the pot. The shadowy figure reappeared, towering over Ikeen, its red eyes glowing brighter than before. "You have chosen," the spirit said, its voice echoing across the forest. "Your sacrifice is accepted." Before Ogana could reach him, Ikeen turned and smiled. "Take care of Chaik," he whispered, "and never forget what we learned here." The shadow engulfed Ikeen, and just like that, he was gone. The rivers grew still, the forest quiet once more. The glowing pot shattered into pieces, and the air became warm again. Ogana collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Behind him, the third coffin shimmered with light. The lid creaked open, and Chaik sat up, gasping for air. "Ogana?" Chaik's voice was weak, confused. What happened? Ogana ran to his friend, hugging him tightly. "You're back," he cried. But his joy was bittersweet, for Ikeen was gone, and the weight of his sacrifice hung heavy in the air. The next morning, Ogana and Chaik returned to the village. To their surprise, sacks of gold coins awaited them outside their small hut, just as the native doctor had promised. But the riches felt hollow without Ikeen. They had dreamed of wealth together, yet it was Ikeen's selflessness that had paid the ultimate price. The boys never sought wealth again. Instead, they used the money to help their village, building schools, fixing roads, and feeding the poor. They told Ikeen's story to anyone who would listen, ensuring that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Moral lesson: true friendship is not about what you can gain, but what you are willing to sacrifice for others. The pursuit of wealth at all costs can lead to devastating consequences. Greed may promise riches, but it often demands a price far greater than anyone is prepared to pay. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed our story. Please like, share, and subscribe. Bye for now.